Hello, and welcome to what will be the second interview for me regarding the topic of BLM. So today we have Amelie who is joining us. Maybe do you want to quickly introduce yourself?
Yes, so I'm Amelie Elise Annette. I'm currently a senior at Chadwick International, and I'm also currently the president of the Black and Brown Student Union, which is an affinity group that was formed about a year ago last year. So, thank you for having me.
Yes. Once again, thank you for joining me today. So basically, to kind of dive straight into the topic, I'll start with a question that I asked Sid last time during one of my interviews. Um, what do you think is the main idea behind BLM? So, of course, there are a lot of different goals that BLM has, but then what do you think if you had to summarize it into maybe one sentence?
Okay, I think that what Black Lives Matter is trying to achieve is having people recognize the issues that are present within the United States and different countries as well, within the racial lens. And I think it's trying to achieve that recognition and also um, trying to establish a sense of equity between or equality between um, Black people and white people and all different kinds of races as well.
Yes. And to kind of add on to what you were saying, you brought up a point that I wanted to ask you is when we think about BLM or when people hear about BLM, it's focused around America, like what's going on in America or what's going on in Europe, not so much, um, other countries, for example, Korea. BLM is a topic of discussion, but it's not as mainstream as it is in those other countries. So, why do you think BLM is still a relevant issue in countries like Korea?
I think that, of course, depending on the context and the culture, of course, these kinds of issues won't be as recognized or maybe not as relevant or thought to be relevant. But I think that um, anywhere in the world, there is some sense of racial inequality. And in our open letter last or June, we discussed that it is really important to recognize in international communities like at Chadwick or like in Korea. Even though it may be a homogenous culture, there are still foreigners, and so there are still different mindsets that need to be um, considered. And um, yeah, these topics do need to still be discussed. Yeah.
Yes. Um, yeah, and I think basically last time and during the last interview with Sid, we talked about something very similar about how although it may appear to be an issue that isn't as relevant or that it's thought to be not as relevant, because the focus of BLM is on solving the issue of racial inequality, as you pointed out earlier, and that's really applicable to any situation, to any society, any community where there is um, a diversity of races, of ethnicities amongst the members of that community, and especially like you said, Chadwick International and other such international schools. Obviously, there are people from many different cultures, from many different backgrounds,
Right.
um, and so it's a really great platform to start off, I think. Yes. So a question that I wanted to ask you was, if we look at the overall history of the issue of racial inequality, so not just BLM, but just racial inequality in general, um, there was one of the most, I guess, iconic movements was the civil rights movement. right? And BLM, in a way, is a sort of modern day extension of that, I feel like. But then there are obviously there can be some differences and similarities. So maybe could you point out what are some of the major differences and major similarities between the civil rights movement and the BLM movement of today?
Yeah, so like you said, I think the Black Lives Matter movement is a more modern, I think, continuation of the civil rights movement in the 60s. And I think that a big difference was or is that I think the time period is one, and like the whole context of the civil rights movement in the 60s, there was still segregation uh, and so like different, I guess, environment uh, for Black people to kind of speak up. And now I think there have been a lot of changes and improvements, but it's still not um, enough. And I think that's why Black Lives Matter came about, because although the Civil Rights Act and movement did bring up some changes, I think that's why Black Lives Matter is still going now, because um, there's still not enough changes. Yeah.
Yes. Um, then kind of adding on to what you were saying, like you said, the civil rights movement, it was a very big achievement. And BLM is, like you said, a sort of continuation of that, of trying to strive for that ultimate goal of achieving racial equality. Um, so let's say, for example, BLM kind of ended as a movement, kind of in a similar way as the civil rights movement, how it's um, we don't, like, for example, say call it the civil rights movement anymore, it's the BLM movement. So let's say, for example, we moved on to a different movement, it's still a similar idea, a similar goal that they're trying to achieve, but in a different time period in the future, and probably a different context, like in the case of civil rights movement versus BLM. um, do you think that at that time period, maybe BLM, okay, to make it kind of clear, what do you think BLM would have achieved at that time period?
Well, I think,
It's a
I
very
mean, there
hard question and a little bit
yeah, yeah.
confusing.
Um, I think now I'm thinking about Ta-Nehisi Coates's case for reparations, which I analyzed in English class this year. But he mentioned that um, like reparations themselves is not enough, and I think that the foundation of the United States is what needs to be changed. I think that um, they're just all the systems that are present there are biased and intended for a certain group of people, namely white people, to be put on top and for everyone else to be put on the bottom. So I think it's not something that can just be like, I can't say when it will be achieved, but I think that's what would need to happen for it to be successful, I guess. A new foundation where systems are more equal and fair, and where everyone has an equal opportunity to be successful in the States. Yeah.
Yes. So kind of reforming, I guess, or reorganizing of the current structure that they
Yeah.
have. And of course, that would also extend to not just America, but like we said earlier, to other countries, where we see um, a lot. Usually, they have very similar, systems where they prefer the majority of the population. Um, and so, moving on, this is a question that's kind of very similar, but then a little bit more short term. So
Mhm.
it is almost the New Year's, right? At the time of us meeting. And so in a few days, I think like actually 2 days, it's going to be 2021. Um,
Right.
People have mixed hopes for 2021. Um, we don't want to get too excited in case something like COVID happens again, but then still, it is a new year. We want it to be better than 2020. What do you think BLM will look like in 2021?
I think pretty similar to what it has been this past year. I think that definitely in May or June, when it first, like the reprise of it came about, I think it was definitely really strong, but, and it still is, but it's not being talked about as much. And I think that, um, I guess in 2021, I think many people are going to be trying to, including me, trying to bring that back up into conversation because it's been kind of, um, I guess, pushed back in the media, and so it's not being as talked about as much. And one thing that has kind of happened in some different states this past year is defunding the police, which I think will continue to happen. Um, and yeah, I mean, I'm not really sure exactly how it will continue, but I think um, mainly just trying to bring it back up again and continuing the protests, and continuing to try and spread awareness and uh, recognizing the different issues that are present within the states and other countries as well.
Yeah. And I think, like you said, just 2020, obviously, there were a lot of things that happened, especially with COVID-19. So
Mhm.
some of those other issues like BLM that were strong and would have probably gotten a lot more media attention kind of got a little bit drowned out, I guess, by by just like a swarm of other issues. But, with the vaccine possibly coming, and
Right.
also with the results of the 2020 elections, right, with the American presidential elections and the um, Senate and House of Representatives, a lot of people um, have hopes that there will be more change, especially from the side of the government with regards to these topics. Um, or at least that's what I've heard. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So you also brought up um, the topic of defunding the police, and that was something that I also wanted to talk about was from a person who is, let's say, like a third party person or someone who is not as knowledgeable about the issue. Hearing, okay, Black Lives Matter and defund the police, it might be hard to kind of draw the connection between
Mhm.
why those two are related. So maybe could you give a brief explanation of why it's like that cause and effect relationship?
Yeah, definitely. So just first, I'd like to say, if anyone is struggling to understand any of the issues that we're talking about today, I strongly suggest literally just going onto the internet and searching these different terms because I think, especially for me, and I think for a lot of people, doing a lot of research about these topics and um, looking at the history, I think that has been really helpful in understanding. So for defunding the police, it's mainly suggesting that a lot of police officers or police organizations are overfunded, and so like different areas like education and healthcare don't receive the funding or attention that they should be. And so, what defunding the police is suggesting that moving some of those funds to different sectors, and then also making sure that police officers don't have to handle every single situation that mental health experts or um, different like nurses and doctors can also help, or social workers can also help in different situations. Because I think that one of the main reasons why Black Lives Matter started or came about in 2013 was because of the shooting of Trayvon Martin. And there have been continuous number of police shootings of unarmed Black men and Black women. And so I think that's why defunding the police is pretty much directly connected to the Black Lives Matter movement.
Yes.